On March 14, 1859, 17 physicians gathered in a locked chamber at the Medical College of South Carolina in Charleston. They had come to witness something that contradicted every scientific principle they'd been taught about the human mind. A 10-year-old boy, property of Colonel Edmund Vance of Beaufort County, could perform mathematical calculations that took trained scholars hours to complete, doing so in seconds, entirely in his head. But what disturbed these men of science wasn't just the speed of his calculations, it was that he was black. And in 1859, that impossibility threatened to unravel the very foundation upon which their entire world was built. The boy's name was Caleb, and before we continue with his story, a story that 3 separate institutions tried to bury in their archives, I need you to do something. Subscribe to this channel, because what you're about to hear has been hidden in medical journals and private letters for over 160 years. And leave a comment telling me what state or city you're listening from. I want to know where this story reaches. Now, let's go back to the beginning, to a cotton plantation where a child's gift would become his curse. Beaufort County, South Carolina, stretched along the Atlantic coast like a patchwork of wealth built on human suffering. By 1859, the county's sea island cotton had made its plantation owners some of the richest men in America. The Vance Plantation, locally known as Riverside, encompassed nearly 4,000 acres of prime agricultural land, worked by over 200 enslaved people. The main house, a Greek Revival mansion with 16 Doric columns, stood on a bluff overlooking the Combahee River, a constant reminder of Colonel Edmund Vance's position among South Carolina's planter aristocracy. The colonel himself was 53 that year, a man whose military title came from his service in the Seminole Wars rather than any recent conflict. He carried himself with the rigid bearing of someone who believed deeply in natural hierarchies, in the God-given order of things. His library contained works by Dr. Samuel Cartwright and Josiah Nott, physicians who had dedicated their careers to proving the biological inferiority of the African race. Vance often quoted from these texts during dinner parties, reassuring his fellow planters that science itself confirmed what they all knew to be true. He was a man who needed the world to make sense in a particular way, who needed his wealth and power to be justified by something greater than mere force. Science gave him that justification. Caleb was born on the plantation in late 1848 or early 1849, the exact date unrecorded, as was common for enslaved children. His mother, Ruth, worked in the main house as a seamstress, a position that offered slight protection from the brutality of field work. She had been brought to Riverside at age 15, sold from a smaller plantation in Georgia after her previous owner's death. His father had been sold away before Caleb's first birthday, transported to a sugar plantation in Louisiana, where the life expectancy for field workers rarely exceeded 7 years. Ruth never spoke his name aloud after that, as if silence could protect her from the memory of loss. What made Caleb different became apparent before he could even form complete sentences. At age 3, he could recite entire conversations he'd heard days earlier, word for word, capturing not just the content, but the exact inflections and pauses. The house slaves noticed first, whispering among themselves about the strange child who seemed to remember everything he ever heard or saw. Ruth tried to hide her son's abilities, understanding instinctively that being remarkable was dangerous when you were someone else's property. She'd seen what happened to enslaved people who stood out. The strong ones were worked to death in the fields. The beautiful ones disappeared into masters' bedrooms and emerged broken. The clever ones who spoke too well or read too quickly were sold away to places where questions weren't asked, and bodies were returned only when they'd stopped breathing. Ruth taught Caleb to keep his eyes down, his voice quiet, his extraordinariness hidden beneath layers of deliberate mediocrity. For several years, it worked. Caleb moved through the plantation like a shadow, unnoticed by the white family, unremarkable to the overseers. But some gifts cannot be concealed forever, no matter how carefully they're wrapped in silence. It was Colonel Vance's youngest son, Marcus, who first discovered what Caleb could do with numbers. Marcus was 14 in 1857, a boy struggling under the weight of his father's expectations. His older brother Edmund Jr. excelled at everything: riding, shooting, his studies. Marcus, by contrast, was soft-spoken and clumsy, more interested in books than hunting, a disappointment to a father who valued strength above all else. His mathematics tutor, a stern man from Charleston named Mr. Coopersmith, had little patience for Marcus's struggles with numbers. One afternoon in August, frustrated by a particularly difficult problem involving compound interest, Marcus threw his slate down in the courtyard where several enslaved children were sweeping. The slate landed near Caleb, then about 8 years old, cracking slightly against the brick pavement. "Stupid numbers," Marcus muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "Who can calculate 7% compound interest on $4,000 over 9 years? Caleb, who had glanced at the slate for perhaps 3 seconds before Marcus retrieved it, spoke without thinking. $5,835.47, sir." The courtyard went silent. The other children stopped sweeping. Marcus stared at the boy, his face cycling through confusion, disbelief, and something that might have been fear. Then he snatched up the slate and ran to find his tutor, leaving Caleb standing alone in the sudden quiet. 20 minutes later, Marcus returned with Mr. Coopersmith. The tutor's face was skeptical, almost amused. "The boy happened to overhear you working through this problem earlier," he said. "He's simply repeating what he heard." "I never worked through it," Marcus insisted. "I couldn't solve it. That's why I threw the slate." Mr. Coopersmith pulled a piece of chalk from his pocket and wrote a new problem on the courtyard wall. 347 multiplied by 283. He turned to Caleb. "Well?" Caleb felt his mother's eyes on him from the window where she worked. He knew he should pretend ignorance, should claim he'd been lucky with the first answer. But something in him, pride, foolishness, or simply the inability to hide what came to him as naturally as breathing, made him answer, 98,201, sir." Mr. Coopersmith worked through the problem on paper. When he looked up, his face had gone pale. "Correct." He tested Caleb with 5 more problems, each more complex than the last. Each time, the boy provided the correct answer within seconds, his eyes distant, as if he were reading numbers written in the air that only he could see. That evening, Colonel Vance was summoned from his study. He stood in the courtyard as the afternoon light faded, his face unreadable, watching as his son's tutor tested this slave child with calculations that Vance himself couldn't solve without extensive work. The colonel said nothing for a long time after Mr. Coopersmith finished his demonstration. He simply looked at Caleb, and there was something in that gaze that made the boy want to run, to hide, to be anywhere but under the scrutiny of this man who owned not just his labor, but his very existence. "How do you do this?" Vance finally asked, his voice carefully neutral. Caleb struggled to explain, his words stumbling over themselves. "I see the numbers, sir. They arrange themselves. Like looking at a picture, but the picture is made of numbers that move and connect." Vance dismissed him with a wave. That night, Ruth held her son in their small cabin behind the main house, and for the first time in years, she allowed herself to cry. "You've been seen now," she whispered into his hair. "And being seen is the most dangerous thing that can happen to us." For 3 weeks, Colonel Vance said nothing about what he'd witnessed. He conducted his plantation business as usual, entertaining guests, reviewing account books, disciplining slaves who displeased him. But late at night, he sat alone in his library, wrestling with a problem that his extensive reading had not prepared him to solve. Everything he'd been taught, everything he believed about the natural order, insisted that what he'd seen was impossible. The African brain, according to every medical text in his library, lacked the capacity for abstract reasoning, for complex calculation, for the higher functions of intellect that distinguished civilized men from savage ones. Yet he had witnessed with his own eyes a slave child performing calculations that surpassed those of educated white men. There were only a few possible explanations. The first was that his entire worldview, and the worldview of every planter in the South, was built on a lie. The second was that this particular child was some kind of extraordinary anomaly, a statistical outlier that proved nothing about the general rule. The third was that there was some trick, some deception he hadn't detected. Vance needed to know which explanation was correct. His wealth, his social position, his very sense of self depended on understanding the true nature of what he'd witnessed. He began testing Caleb himself, calling the boy to his study night after night. At first, Ruth was allowed to accompany her son, standing silently in the corner while the colonel posed mathematical problems. But after the first week, Vance began dismissing her. Caleb would enter the study alone, the heavy door closing behind him with a sound like a coffin lid. The colonel's tests grew increasingly elaborate. He posed problems from university mathematics textbooks. He created complex scenarios involving plantation economics, calculating yields, interest rates, compound depreciation. He tested Caleb's memory by reading long strings of numbers and asking the boy to repeat them backwards. He tried to trick him with problems that had no solution or multiple solutions. Through it all, Caleb maintained his accuracy. His answers came with the same disturbing speed, his explanations remaining consistent. He saw the numbers as shapes, as colors, as patterns that arranged themselves into solutions. But what Vance began to notice, what perhaps disturbed him more than the calculations themselves, was that the boy showed no emotion. No pride in his correct answers, no fear of failure, no reaction whatsoever to Vance's mounting frustration. It was as if Caleb had learned to make himself hollow, to become a vessel that processed numbers but felt nothing. Ruth saw the change in her son. Each night when he returned from these sessions, he was more withdrawn, more distant. She would ask what the colonel wanted, and Caleb would simply say, "Numbers, Mama, just numbers." But his eyes held something else, a kind of wary knowledge that children shouldn't possess, an understanding that he had become valuable in a way that made him less safe, not more. The other enslaved people at Riverside noticed too. They whispered among themselves when the overseers weren't near. Some were proud. Here was proof that they were not what the white folks claimed them to be. Others were afraid, knowing that Caleb's gift would bring trouble to them all. And a few were quietly envious, wondering why this particular boy had been given something special when they all suffered equally. An older woman named Temperance, who worked in the kitchen, pulled Ruth aside one morning in December. "You need to make that boy stupid," she said bluntly. "Make him forget his numbers before the colonel decides he's worth more as a curiosity than as a worker." "I can't," Ruth whispered. "He can't help what he knows any more than he can help breathing." "Then God help you both," Temperance replied, "because I've seen what happens when masters get too interested in one of us. It never ends well." Her words proved prophetic. In January 1858, Colonel Vance made a decision. He would demonstrate Caleb's abilities to select members of Charleston's medical community. Not publicly, he understood the dangers of that, but to a carefully chosen group of physicians whose opinions carried weight. If they could verify that Caleb's abilities were genuine, it would satisfy Vance's need for external confirmation. And if they could explain the mechanism behind those abilities in a way that didn't challenge the fundamental assumptions about racial hierarchy, so much the better. The invitation letters went out in mid-January. They were carefully worded, promising a demonstration of unusual mental phenomena without specifying the race of the subject. Vance wanted the physicians to arrive without preconceptions, to witness first before their prejudices could cloud their judgment. Among those invited was Dr. Nathaniel Crawford, a professor at the Medical College of South Carolina and a vocal advocate of polygenism. The theory that different races were actually different species created separately by God or nature. Dr. Crawford had published several papers arguing that the African brain was fundamentally incapable of abstract reasoning, that the skull structure itself prevented the development of higher cognitive functions. He'd built his reputation on these theories, and defending them had become central to his identity. Also invited was Dr. Thomas Aldrich, an older physician who'd practiced in Charleston for 30 years. Unlike Crawford, Aldrich had maintained some intellectual humility, a willingness to admit when he didn't understand something. He'd seen too much in his decades of practice to be completely certain of anything. The third key guest was Dr. Harrison Webb, recently returned from medical studies in Europe. Webb was younger, only 31, and his time abroad had exposed him to theories that hadn't yet reached the American South. He'd read papers by French and German physicians describing cases of extraordinary mental abilities, calculating prodigies, individuals with perfect memory, people who could perceive numbers as colors or sounds. These cases appeared across all races and social classes, suggesting that such abilities were quirks of individual brain function rather than markers of racial superiority. The examination was scheduled for February 7, 1858, at the Riverside Plantation. Vance wanted his home ground for this demonstration, wanted to maintain control of every variable. The night before the examination, Ruth barely slept. She lay in the darkness of their cabin, listening to Caleb's breathing, wondering if this would be the last night they spent under the same roof. She'd heard stories. Enslaved people with unusual abilities who'd been sold to traveling shows, who'd been taken north by curious scientists, who'd simply disappeared and were never heard from again. What if these doctors decided they wanted to study Caleb somewhere else? What if they convinced the colonel to sell him? Vance was a businessman before anything else. If the price was right, he'd sell his own shadow. She thought about running, taking Caleb and disappearing into the night, following the drinking gourd north like so many had before them. But she was a seamstress, not a field hand. She didn't know the land, didn't know which stars to follow, didn't know which white faces might help and which would return them for the reward. And Caleb was too young, too small to travel fast and far. They'd be caught within days, and the punishment for attempted escape was brutal. So she did the only thing she could do. She held her son and prayed to a God she wasn't sure was listening. The physicians arrived at Riverside in the early afternoon. 6 men in total, dressed in the formal black coats and high collars that marked them as professionals. Colonel Vance greeted them in his drawing room, offering brandy and cigars, making small talk about Charleston society, the weather, the political situation. He was establishing atmosphere, demonstrating his status as their social equal before revealing that the subject of their examination was his property. When he finally explained the purpose of their visit, that he owned a slave child with extraordinary calculating abilities, the reaction was mixed. Dr. Crawford's face showed immediate skepticism, bordering on disdain. Doctor. Aldrich leaned forward with interest. Dr. Webb remained neutral, waiting to observe before forming conclusions. The other 3 physicians exchanged glances that suggested they suspected they'd been brought to witness some kind of parlor trick. Caleb was brought to the drawing room by Marcus, who'd been instructed to fetch him from the cabin, where Ruth had been carefully grooming him for the past hour. The boy wore clean clothes that marked him as house property rather than field labor. A white cotton shirt, dark trousers that were slightly too large, no shoes. His hands were scrubbed clean, his hair cut short. He looked younger than his 9 years, small and thin, his eyes fixed on the floor. The 6 white men in the drawing room fell silent as he entered. There was something uncomfortable in that moment, an unspoken tension that Caleb could feel even without understanding its source. These men had agreed to examine a slave, but now that they saw him, a child, obviously nervous, obviously powerless, some of them felt a twinge of something that might have been shame. Dr. Crawford cleared his throat. "Well, Colonel, shall we proceed?" The examination began simply. Dr. Crawford posed basic arithmetic problems, testing whether Caleb could add and subtract large numbers. The boy answered correctly each time, his responses coming quickly but not suspiciously fast. Crawford's expression suggested he was mentally calculating the same problems, verifying each answer. So far, nothing impressive. Then Crawford moved to multiplication. 3 digits by 2 digits, then 3 by 3, then 4 by 3. Each time, Caleb provided the correct answer within seconds. The physicians began checking his answers against their own calculations, which took several minutes of work with pencil and paper. Every answer was accurate. Dr. Webb spoke up. How do you arrive at these answers? Can you explain your process? Caleb hesitated, glancing at Colonel Vance for permission to speak freely. Vance nodded almost imperceptibly. I see the numbers, sir, Caleb said quietly. They appear in my mind like pictures, but not pictures exactly. Each number has a shape and a color. Small numbers are bright, clear. Large numbers are darker, heavier. When you ask me to multiply, the numbers move toward each other, and when they meet, they make new shapes, new colors, and the answer is the color that appears strongest. The room went very quiet. Dr. Crawford's face had darkened. The boy is describing nonsense, he said flatly. Numbers don't have colors. This is either deliberate deception or evidence of mental deficiency masquerading as ability. Or, Dr. Webb countered carefully, it's evidence of a perceptual phenomenon we don't fully understand. I've read cases in European medical literature of individuals who experience numbers, sounds, or even concepts as having sensory properties like color or spatial position. The mechanism is unknown, but the phenomenon appears genuine. European literature, Dr. Crawford said dismissively. Continental physicians have grown too liberal in their thinking, too willing to entertain fanciful notions. We're here to determine if this boy's abilities are real, or if the colonel has been duped by some clever memorization trick. Then test me with something I couldn't have memorized, Caleb said. Every head in the room turned toward him. Enslaved children didn't speak unless spoken to, certainly didn't challenge white men, never showed anything resembling boldness. Colonel Vance's face went rigid with anger at the breach of protocol. But before he could respond, Dr. Aldrich spoke. The boy makes a fair point. If we want to eliminate the possibility of memorization, we need to pose problems he couldn't have anticipated. He pulled a pocket watch from his vest and studied it for a moment. It's currently 2:47 in the afternoon. How many seconds have passed since midnight? Caleb's eyes went distant for perhaps 5 seconds. 57,420 seconds, sir. Dr. Aldrich worked through the calculation on paper, a process that took him nearly 3 minutes. When he looked up, his expression had changed. Correct. The examination continued for another 2 hours. The physicians took turns posing increasingly complex problems. Division with large numbers, calculation of compound interest over multiple years, geometric problems requiring spatial reasoning. They even tested Caleb's memory by reading a string of 30 random digits and asking him to repeat them backwards. He did so without error. Through it all, Colonel Vance watched his property perform, his face showing nothing of what he was thinking. But internally he was wrestling with contradictory emotions. Pride that he owned something so unusual, so valuable. Anxiety about what these physicians might conclude. And underneath it all, a growing unease that perhaps everything he believed about the natural order was less certain than he'd assumed. Dr. Crawford grew increasingly frustrated as the examination progressed. Each test he designed to expose fraud or limitation only demonstrated the breadth of Caleb's abilities. Finally, in a tone sharp with irritation, he said, "Colonel Vance, I must ask, how much time have you spent training this boy? How many hours of instruction in mathematics?" "None," Vance replied. "He's never been taught to read or write. He's never seen the inside of a schoolroom. Until 3 months ago, I didn't know he could count past 10. "Impossible," Crawford said flatly. "Mathematical ability of this level requires years of instruction and practice. The boy must have somehow gained access to educational materials, must have been secretly taught." "By whom?" Dr. Webb interrupted. "Colonel Vance runs a plantation, not a school. Who would have taught an enslaved child advanced mathematics, and to what purpose?" The question hung in the air, unanswerable. The examination concluded with no consensus among the physicians. Dr. Crawford left, insisting that some deception must be involved, though he couldn't identify what form it took. Dr. Webb wanted to conduct more extensive testing to understand the mechanism of Caleb's ability. Dr. Aldrich simply admitted he'd witnessed something he couldn't explain with existing medical theory. As the physicians departed, their carriages disappearing down the long drive lined with live oaks, Colonel Vance stood on his front porch with his hand on Marcus's shoulder. "What do you think, boy?" he asked his son. "What did we demonstrate today?" Marcus, who'd watched the entire examination from a chair in the corner, took a long time to answer. "I think we proved that Caleb is smarter than all of them," he finally said. "And I think that scares them." Vance's hand tightened on his son's shoulder, not quite painful but close. "Don't ever say that again," he said quietly. "Not to me, not to anyone. Do you understand?" Marcus nodded, but something in his eyes suggested he'd already understood more than his father wanted him to know. That night, Ruth held Caleb in their cabin while he trembled with exhaustion and something deeper than fear. "What happens now, Mama?" he asked. She had no answer that wouldn't terrify him further, so she simply held him tighter and hummed an old song her own mother had sung, back before Ruth had been sold away from everyone she'd ever loved. What happened next was both predictable and terrible. Word of the examination spread through Charleston's medical community, despite Colonel Vance's attempts at discretion. The story grew with each retelling. A slave child who could outperform trained mathematicians, who possessed abilities that contradicted established racial science. Some physicians dismissed it as plantation folklore. Others grew curious. And Dr. Crawford, feeling his reputation challenged, began a campaign to definitively disprove or discredit the entire affair. He published a letter in the Charleston Medical Journal in March 1858, describing the examination in carefully chosen terms that emphasized what he saw as methodological flaws while downplaying the actual demonstration of Caleb's abilities. He suggested that Colonel Vance, a man of good standing but lacking scientific training, had been deceived by a clever memorization trick, or possibly by some form of ventriloquism or deception involving the child's mother. The letter sparked responses. Dr. Webb published a rebuttal, pointing out that Crawford's suggested explanations didn't account for what all 6 physicians had actually witnessed. Dr. Aldrich added his own observations, noting that he'd personally devised several of the test problems on the spot, and that Caleb had solved them with no possibility of prior preparation. The controversy divided Charleston's medical establishment. Some physicians saw it as a fascinating case study in unusual mental ability. Others viewed it as a dangerous challenge to scientific theories that justified the entire social structure of the South. And a few saw opportunity. If this slave child truly possessed such remarkable abilities, what could be learned from studying him more extensively? In April 1858, Colonel Vance received a letter from a physician in Boston, Dr. William Garrison, no relation to the famous abolitionist, though the surname alone made Vance suspicious. Dr. Garrison wrote that he was conducting research into exceptional mental abilities and requested permission to examine Caleb under controlled scientific conditions. The letter was polite, but its subtext was clear. Northern science wanted to weigh in on a phenomenon that Southern science couldn't adequately explain. Vance burned the letter in his study fireplace and never replied. The last thing he needed was Northern interference, Northern scrutiny, Northern physicians using his property to make arguments about racial equality. The political situation was already tense. In Kansas, pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers were engaging in open warfare. In Washington, the debates over slavery's expansion into new territories grew increasingly heated. South Carolina's fire-eaters were openly discussing secession. The last thing any of this needed was a slave child who could challenge the scientific justification for the institution itself. Vance made a decision. No more demonstrations. No more examinations. Caleb would remain at Riverside, his abilities acknowledged but not publicized, a curiosity kept private rather than displayed. For several months this approach seemed to work. The controversy in Charleston's medical journals gradually died down, replaced by other debates, other topics. Life at Riverside returned to its normal rhythms, but Caleb had been seen now, and being seen changed everything. The other enslaved people at Riverside treated him differently. some with a kind of awed distance, others with resentment that he'd been given something special while they had nothing. The overseers watched him more closely, suspicious of any slave who'd attracted the master's attention for reasons other than punishment. And Marcus, the colonel's youngest son, developed what could only be described as an obsession. Marcus had always been the disappointment, the soft son who preferred books to horses, who flinched from violence, who would never live up to his father's expectations. But he was still a Vance, still a white boy in a world that told him he was inherently superior to every black person he encountered. Caleb's abilities created an uncomfortable contradiction in Marcus's mind. How could someone who was supposed to be inferior perform calculations that Marcus himself couldn't comprehend? He began seeking out Caleb when no one else was watching. At first, he simply posed mathematical problems, testing the boundaries of what Caleb could do. But gradually, their interactions took on a darker quality. Marcus would pose impossible problems, hoping to finally find the limit of Caleb's ability, to prove that there was something the slave boy couldn't do. When Caleb continued to answer correctly, Marcus's frustration grew into something uglier. One afternoon in June 1858, Marcus found Caleb alone in the stable, doing some task his mother had assigned. "Calculate this," Marcus demanded, and rattled off a complex problem involving multiple operations. Caleb answered within seconds. Marcus's face flushed red. "You're cheating somehow," he said. "You have to be. My father's books say your kind can't think like this." Caleb knew better than to respond, but something in him, maybe exhaustion, maybe a spark of defiance, made him meet Marcus's eyes. "Then maybe the books are wrong, sir." Marcus slapped him hard enough that Caleb fell to the ground. The stable spun around him, his ear ringing. "Don't you ever," Marcus hissed, "ever suggest that I'm wrong, you understand? You're property. You exist because we allow you to exist. You think because my father finds your tricks amusing that makes you special? You're nothing. Remember that." He walked away, leaving Caleb on the stable floor, blood trickling from his nose. Caleb didn't tell his mother about the incident. What would be the point? Marcus was the master's son. Even if Ruth complained, which she couldn't do without risking far worse, nothing would happen except more attention, more scrutiny, more danger. But something shifted in Caleb that day. He began to understand that his gift wasn't just dangerous because it made him valuable. It was dangerous because it challenged the stories these white people told themselves about who they were and who he was supposed to be. His existence, his ability to do things they insisted he shouldn't be able to do, was a threat to their entire world. And threatened people were capable of anything. The summer of 1858 was brutal. The heat hung heavy over Beaufort County, thick and damp as a blanket. The cotton grew tall in the fields, requiring endless labor from enslaved workers who moved through the rows from dawn until dark. Caleb remained in the main house most days, spared from field work, but not from labor. He helped his mother with sewing, ran errands for the white family, cleaned and polished, and generally tried to be invisible. But Colonel Vance hadn't forgotten about him. If anything, the controversy in Charleston had made Vance more interested, more determined to understand the nature of what he owned. He continued calling Caleb to his study several nights a week, testing him with increasingly obscure problems. "You will explain your methods when asked. If you fail to answer, or if you answer incorrectly, we will note it. If you refuse to cooperate, this examination will end immediately. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir." "Then let us proceed." What followed was unlike any of the previous examinations Caleb had undergone. This wasn't a demonstration for curious guests or a private session with the colonel. This was an interrogation, systematic and thorough, designed to find the boundaries of his ability or the mechanisms of any deception. The physicians took turns posing problems, each man apparently trying to outdo the previous one in complexity or obscurity. They started with arithmetic, multiplication and division of increasingly large numbers. Caleb answered each problem correctly and quickly. They moved to fractions and decimals, testing whether he could work with partial numbers. He could. They posed word problems requiring multiple steps of calculation. He solved them. They gave him geometric problems, algebraic equations, questions involving ratios and proportions. Through it all, Caleb maintained his accuracy. His answers came with the same characteristic speed, and he tried to explain his process when asked. The way numbers appeared to him as colors and shapes, how solutions emerged from patterns he perceived rather than calculations he consciously performed. Some of the physicians made notes, others whispered to their neighbors. Doctor Crawford's face grew increasingly red as the examination progressed, his questions becoming more aggressive in tone, even as Caleb continued to answer them correctly. After 2 hours, Dr. Crawford called for a break. The physicians gathered in small clusters, debating what they'd witnessed. Caleb was left sitting alone at the central table, not permitted to leave, not offered water or food, simply made to wait while others discussed him as if he weren't present. Dr. Webb approached the table during this break. He looked at Caleb with something that might have been sympathy. "How do you feel?" he asked quietly. The question was so unexpected that Caleb didn't know how to answer. No one had asked him how he felt about anything since this began. "Tired, sir," he finally said. Webb nodded. "I imagine so. Caleb, I want you to understand something. What you're demonstrating today is extraordinary. There are perhaps a handful of people in the world who can do what you do with numbers. That makes you rare. But it also makes you..." He trailed off, seeming to search for words. "It makes things complicated. Do you understand?" "I think so, sir. I hope you do," Webb said quietly. "Because what happens after today depends on how these men choose to interpret what they've seen. And men have a remarkable capacity to interpret evidence in ways that support what they already believe." Before Caleb could respond, Dr. Crawford called the group back to order. The second phase of the examination was about to begin, and this one would be different. The physicians had apparently agreed on a different approach. Instead of simply testing Caleb's ability, they would try to determine its mechanism, to find the boundary where his talent ended. Dr. Samuel Henderson, the mathematician from South Carolina College, took charge of this section. He'd brought several advanced mathematics textbooks and now posed problems from them. Equations that his own advanced students struggled with, proofs that required understanding of mathematical principles beyond simple calculation. The first problem was a quadratic equation. 3o2 plus 7x, 12e0. "Solve for x," Henderson instructed. Caleb stared at the equation on the slate where Henderson had written it. This wasn't like the other problems. This required understanding abstract symbols, the relationship between variables, the very concept of solving for an unknown. He'd never been taught algebra. He'd never seen equations like this before. But as he stared at the symbols, something shifted in his mind. The numbers and letters began to arrange themselves into patterns. The equation wasn't asking him what the numbers equaled. It was describing a relationship, a balance that had to be maintained. He could see where that balance existed, could perceive the values that would make the equation true. "X equals 1 1/3, he said slowly, or x equals -3. Henderson worked through the problem using the quadratic formula, a process that took several minutes of careful calculation. When he looked up, his face had gone pale. Both answers are correct. A murmur ran through the assembled physicians. Dr. Crawford stood abruptly. "That's impossible. The boy has never been taught algebra. He cannot understand the symbolic manipulation required to solve such an equation. He must have seen this specific problem before." "I created this problem last night," Henderson interrupted firmly. "I showed it to no one. The boy could not possibly have encountered it previously." "Then explain how he solved it." Crawford's voice was rising, his carefully maintained professional demeanor cracking. "If he doesn't understand algebraic principles, if he's never been taught the quadratic formula, how did he arrive at the correct answer?" Caleb spoke up, his voice quiet but clear. "I don't understand the formula, sir, but I can see where the equation balances. The symbols have positions and weights, and I can see where they need to be for everything to equal 0. "That's nonsense," Crawford snapped. "You're describing intuition, not mathematical reasoning. True understanding requires... Requires what? Dr. Webb interrupted. Requires formal education. Requires being white. The boy is demonstrating a form of mathematical intuition that we don't fully understand, but that doesn't make it any less real or any less remarkable. It makes it meaningless, Crawford shot back. If he can't explain his process in rational terms, if he's simply intuiting answers without understanding the underlying principles, then he's no different from a calculating machine, a curiosity without true intelligence. Dr. Aldrich stood from his seat. Gentlemen, we're losing sight of our purpose here. We came to determine whether this child's abilities are genuine. I think we've established that they are. The mechanism may be unclear, but the results are undeniable. Perhaps we should focus on documenting what we've observed rather than debating what it means for our theories. But Dr. Crawford wasn't finished. He descended to the central area, his face dark with anger or perhaps something deeper. Fear of what this child's existence implied. I have one more test, he announced. One that will determine whether we're witnessing true intelligence or merely an unusual form of memorization and pattern recognition. He pulled out a fresh sheet of paper and spent several minutes writing out a complex problem. Something involving multiple steps, variables and concepts from advanced mathematics. When he finished, he didn't show the paper to anyone else. Instead, he read the problem aloud to Caleb. You have 3 workers building a wall. Worker A can complete the wall alone in 6 hours. Worker B can complete it in 4 hours. Worker C can complete it in 3 hours. If all 3 workers start together but worker C stops after 1 hour, how long will it take to complete the wall? It was a trick question, layered with complexity designed to confuse. But as Dr. Crawford read it, Caleb's mind automatically began breaking it into components, seeing the rates of work as fractions, visualizing how those fractions combined and changed as conditions shifted. He could see the answer forming like a shape crystallizing from mist. 2 hours and 9 minutes, sir. Approximately 2 hours and 8 minutes and 34 seconds if you need it more precisely. Dr. Crawford worked through the problem on paper, his hand moving quickly as he calculated rates, combined fractions, adjusted for worker C's departure. The room was silent as he worked. 3 minutes passed, then 4. Finally, he set down his pen and looked up, his face an unreadable mask. The answer is correct, he said flatly. Down to the second. The lecture hall erupted in conversation. Some physicians were arguing that this proved Caleb possessed genuine mathematical reasoning. Others insisted it proved nothing except unusual calculating ability. Doctor? Crawford stood in the center of the chaos, staring at Caleb with an expression that made the boy want to run, to hide, to be anywhere but under that gaze. Colonel Vance finally stood and raised his hand for silence. Gentlemen, we've been at this for over 4 hours. The boy has answered every question posed to him. You've tested him with problems ranging from simple arithmetic to advanced mathematics. He has not failed once. I believe we've seen what we came to see. Dr. Crawford turned to Vance, his voice tight. What we've seen is an anomaly, an exception that proves nothing about general rules. This boy may possess an unusual faculty for calculation, but it doesn't challenge the fundamental principles of racial science. The African brain remains, in general and on average, inferior to the European brain in capacity for abstract reasoning, moral judgment, and higher intellectual functions. One exception, if that's what this is, changes nothing. Then why did you insist on this examination? Dr. Webb asked. If you were certain it would prove nothing, why gather 17 physicians and spend an entire afternoon testing a child? Crawford had no answer to that. Or rather, he had an answer he couldn't admit aloud. He'd needed to prove Caleb was a fraud, or a trick, or meaningless, because the alternative was too threatening to everything he'd built his career on. The examination concluded shortly after that. The physicians filed out in small groups, most of them still arguing with each other. Dr. Crawford left without speaking to anyone, his face dark with suppressed fury. Doctor. Webb paused to speak briefly with Colonel Vance, though Caleb couldn't hear what was said. Dr. Aldrich looked at Caleb once more before departing, his expression troubled, as if he'd witnessed something that disturbed his understanding of the world. When the lecture hall was finally empty except for Vance, Marcus, and Caleb, the colonel stood silently for a long moment. Then he turned to his property and said, "You did well. Better than I expected." It wasn't praise exactly. It was acknowledgement, which was somehow worse. Because acknowledgement meant Vance recognized just how unusual Caleb was, which meant the danger was far from over. They returned to the Charleston Hotel that evening. Caleb was put back in the small room off the kitchen, told to wait while the colonel attended to business. He sat alone in the gathering darkness, exhausted beyond anything he'd felt before. It wasn't just the hours of examination, the mental strain of solving problem after problem. It was the weight of being looked at, studied, debated over as if he were a specimen under glass, rather than a child who was tired and scared and wanted his mother. Peter, the hotel worker who'd been assigned to watch him, brought food, bread and stew that Caleb barely touched. "Heard you impressed the doctors," Peter said. "Heard you did calculations nobody else could do." Caleb said nothing. "That good or bad for you, you think?" "I don't know," Caleb admitted. "I don't know what happens now." Peter nodded slowly. "Never do we? We just wait and hope it's not the worst thing." They waited in Charleston for 3 more days. Colonel Vance met with various people, physicians, colleagues from Beaufort County, business associates. Caleb wasn't included in these meetings. He was simply kept available in case further demonstrations were requested. But none came. Whatever had been accomplished or concluded by the examination, it seemed to be enough. On March 18th, they departed Charleston and returned to Riverside. Ruth was waiting when they arrived, her face tight with anxiety that only eased slightly when she saw her son alive and apparently unharmed. That night, alone in their cabin, she held him and asked what had happened. Caleb told her about the examination, about the questions and the arguments and the way the physicians had looked at him. "I think they were trying to decide if I'm real," he said. "If what I can do is real." "And what did they decide?" "I don't think they decided anything. I think some of them believe and some don't, and none of them know what it means." Ruth was silent for a long time. Then she asked the question that had been haunting her for weeks. "Baby, what do you think the colonel will do with you now?" Caleb didn't have an answer. The answer came sooner than either of them expected. In early May 1859, Colonel Vance summoned Caleb to his study one final time. But this meeting was different from the others. Vance didn't have mathematical problems prepared. He didn't have textbooks or papers. He simply gestured for Caleb to sit. Another unprecedented gesture, a slave child being invited to sit in the master's presence, and then spoke in a tone that was almost conversational. "The physicians haven't reached a consensus," Vance said. "Dr. Crawford has published yet another article insisting your abilities are either exaggerated or meaningless. Dr. Webb has defended you, but his voice carries less weight in Charleston these days. Northern sympathies are becoming politically dangerous to express. Dr. Aldrich has said nothing publicly, though I'm told he writes about you in his private journals." He paused, studying Caleb. "The controversy hasn't died down so much as it's been deliberately suppressed. South Carolina is preparing for secession. War is likely coming. The last thing anyone wants is internal division over questions of racial capacity when unity is essential for what's ahead." Caleb listened, not fully understanding all the political implications, but grasping the essential point. He'd become inconvenient. "So here's what's going to happen," Vance continued. "You're going to go work in the fields, not as punishment but as protection. If you're just another field hand among many, you stop being a topic of debate. You become invisible again. And invisibility is the safest thing any of us can be in dangerous times." "Will I see my mother?" Caleb asked. "She'll remain in the main house. You'll see her on Sundays, like the other field workers see their families. That's all I can offer you." It was a sentence wrapped in the language of protection. Caleb understood that, but he also understood that refusing wasn't an option. He nodded his acceptance. "One more thing," Vance said. "Don't use your abilities in the fields. Don't calculate crop yields or solve problems or do anything that draws attention. The overseers don't know about you, and I'd prefer to keep it that way. Just be ordinary. Can you do that?" "Yes, sir," Caleb said, though he wondered how you could stop being what you were, how you could hide a gift that lived inside your mind. The next morning, Caleb was given different clothes, rough homespun that marked field workers, and sent to join the cotton crews. His hands, soft from housework, began to crack and bleed within days. The sun beat down with merciless intensity. The work was endless, repetitive, brutally physical. And through it all, Caleb kept his head down, his mouth shut, his remarkable mind deliberately suppressed beneath layers of forced mediocrity. Ruth watched from the windows of the main house, unable to protect her son, unable to do anything but witness his descent into the kind of labor she'd hoped he'd never have to endure. She continued her seamstress work, her hands moving automatically while her mind stayed with the boy picking cotton under the brutal South Carolina sun. The summer of 1859 passed. The cotton harvest was exceptional that year. Vance's records would later show it as one of his most profitable seasons. The autumn came, and with it, increasingly heated political debates. John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry in October sent shockwaves through the South. South Carolina's newspapers filled with talk of abolition terrorism, northern aggression, the necessity of defending Southern institutions by any means necessary. Through all of this, Caleb worked the fields at Riverside. His hands hardened. His body grew stronger from the labor, and the gift that had once made him special, that had drawn the attention of Charleston's most distinguished physicians, lay dormant beneath the surface of his life like a secret too dangerous to speak aloud. But he still saw the numbers. At night, lying exhausted in the field quarters, he would close his eyes and watch calculations unfold in his mind like flowers blooming in fast motion. How many cotton bolls in a row? How many seconds until sunrise? How many more days until winter? He couldn't stop seeing patterns, couldn't stop his mind from solving problems that no one had asked him to solve. It was simply what he was, what he'd always been, even when the world had decided that what he was couldn't possibly exist. In November 1859, Ruth managed to pass him a message through another enslaved worker. Just 3 words written on a scrap of cloth. Stay alive. Hope. It was all she could offer. It was everything. The year 1860 brought no relief from tension. Abraham Lincoln's election in November triggered exactly the crisis everyone had anticipated. South Carolina seceded in December, and 6 other southern states followed by February. The Confederacy formed. War became inevitable rather than merely probable. Colonel Vance raised a company of infantry from Beaufort County, funded by his cotton profits. He was commissioned as a captain and marched off to Virginia with 83 men, including his eldest son. Marcus remained at Riverside, too young for military service, but old enough to help manage the plantation in his father's absence. The boy who'd once tested Caleb with mathematical problems was now learning to run a slave-holding plantation, learning the skills of command and violence that maintaining such a place required. By April 1861, war had begun in earnest. Fort Sumter fell to Confederate forces. The Union naval blockade tightened around South Carolina's coast. Riverside continued operating, but the world was changing rapidly around it. The certainties that men like Colonel Vance had built their lives on were beginning to crack. And then, in November 1862, Union forces captured the Sea Islands of South Carolina as part of the Port Royal expedition. Beaufort County fell under Union occupation. The Vance family fled, taking what they could carry and abandoning the plantation they'd run for 3 generations. For Caleb, aged 13, and Ruth, the collapse came suddenly. One day, they were enslaved, owned, their entire existence defined by the will of others. The next day, those others were gone, and the world had no clear instructions for what came next. Freedom, when it arrived, was chaos. The Port Royal experiment, the Union's attempt to help formerly enslaved people transition to independent lives, brought teachers, missionaries, and government officials to the Sea Islands. They conducted censuses, established schools, tried to create systems for people who'd never been allowed to own property, make decisions, or control their own labor. A teacher named Elizabeth Bottoom arrived at one of the settlements near what had been Riverside Plantation in January 1863. She was a stern woman from the north, determined to help, but limited in her understanding of what these newly freed people needed. She recorded in her journal meeting with dozens of freed slaves, assessing their abilities, identifying children who might benefit from education. One entry, dated February 14, 1863, reads, "Today I met with a group of field workers who'd been employed at the Vance property. Among them was a youth, perhaps 13 or 14 years old, whose mother described him as having unusual facility with numbers. When I tested him, he demonstrated calculating abilities beyond anything I'd witnessed before, solving complex arithmetic mentally with remarkable speed. I inquired about his background and learned he'd been examined by physicians in Charleston several years prior, though the circumstances remained unclear. I attempted to have him admitted to the school we're establishing for freedmen, but when I returned the following day to make arrangements, both he and his mother had departed. Other freed people in the settlement told me the boy seemed frightened of attention, as if he'd learned that being remarkable led to trouble. I was unable to locate them again despite searching for several weeks. The trail goes cold there. Ruth and Caleb had vanished into the vast diaspora of freed people trying to build lives from the ruins of slavery. Whether they stayed in South Carolina or traveled north, whether they found safety or continued running, whether Caleb ever found circumstances where his remarkable gift could be used openly rather than hidden as a dangerous secret, none of these questions have certain answers. A brief mention in the Charleston Mercury in June 1867 describes a colored youth performing calculations for coins near the Market Street docks. The item notes that the young man claimed to have once been examined by physicians, but such claims are dismissed as common fabrications among the destitute seeking sympathy. Whether this was Caleb or someone else pretending to his story, we can't know. Dr. Harrison Webb survived the war and returned to Charleston to resume his medical practice. In his later years, he never published anything more about Caleb or the controversial examination of 1859. When asked about it by a younger colleague in 1875, Webb reportedly said, "We witnessed something that didn't fit our understanding of the world. Rather than change our understanding, we simply stopped looking. That failure has haunted me more than any patient I lost to disease." Dr. Crawford continued teaching until his death in 1871, never wavering in his conviction that racial hierarchy was scientifically proven. His papers and theories would later be recognized as pseudoscience designed to justify injustice, but during his lifetime they were considered respectable scholarship. He went to his grave believing he'd been correct about everything, except perhaps the question of whether Caleb's abilities had been genuine. Even there, he apparently maintained some doubt, suggesting in his final publication that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and in cases where such evidence challenges fundamental principles, skepticism remains the proper scientific posture. Dr. Aldrich lived until 1879. His private journals, not discovered until the 1930s when they were donated to the South Carolina Historical Society, contain multiple entries about Caleb and the examination. One passage from 1876 stands out. "I have thought often these past years about the boy we examined that March afternoon in 1859. I was present when he solved problems that required genuine mathematical reasoning, not mere calculation. I heard him explain processes that suggested a form of perception or intuition we don't possess the scientific framework to understand. And I witnessed my colleagues, men I'd respected, men trained in careful observation, reject what they'd seen because accepting it would require reconsidering beliefs they'd built their careers and identities upon. We called it science, but it was cowardice. We had evidence before us and chose to dismiss it rather than follow where it led. We saw a human mind performing extraordinary functions and chose to focus on the color of the skin housing that mind. We claimed to be seekers of truth, but were actually defenders of comfortable lies. I wonder what became of him. I wonder what he might have accomplished had he been born white, or born in a different time, or simply born in a world that could accept evidence over ideology. I wonder how many other Calebs there were, how many remarkable minds were crushed by a system that needed them to be unremarkable to maintain its own illusions. And I carry shame for my part in that crushing, for my silence when I should have spoken, for my caution when boldness was required. We had a choice that day, to let evidence change our theories or to reject evidence that challenged our comfort. We chose wrong, and I will answer for that choice when I stand before whatever judgment awaits us all. The Medical College of South Carolina's official records contain only the briefest mention of the examination. March 14, 1859, special lecture on unusual mental phenomena. Demonstration of calculating ability in a subject of African descent. Inconclusive findings. Inconclusive. That single word, buried in administrative records, summarizing an event that 17 physicians had witnessed that had sparked months of controversy, that had challenged the scientific foundations of racial ideology. Not inconclusive because they couldn't determine if Caleb's abilities were real. Every physician present had watched him solve problems correctly, had verified his answers, had failed to find any mechanism of fraud or deception. Inconclusive because they couldn't acknowledge what those abilities meant without unraveling the moral justification for their entire society. It was easier to file the matter away as inconclusive than to follow the evidence where it led. Easier to maintain comfortable theories than to confront uncomfortable truths. Easier to let one child disappear into obscurity than to reconsider whether millions of enslaved people might possess capacities that the entire economic and social system of the South insisted they couldn't have. So what really happened to Caleb? We'll never know for certain. The historical record goes silent, as it does for so many formerly enslaved people whose lives were considered insufficiently important to document. He may have survived the chaos of war and Reconstruction, may have found some measure of peace, may have lived a quiet life where his gift remained hidden, but he remained safe. Or he may have become another casualty of a world that couldn't accommodate what he represented, lost to disease, violence, or simple poverty before he reached adulthood. But here's what we do know for certain. In March 1859, a 10-year-old enslaved child demonstrated mathematical abilities that 17 physicians witnessed and couldn't adequately explain with their existing theories. Rather than letting that evidence challenge their assumptions about human capacity and racial hierarchy, they chose to dismiss it, to bury it, to label it inconclusive and move on. They weren't bad men necessarily. They were men of their time, products of their culture, believers in theories that gave them comfort and justified their privileges. But they had a choice, and they chose their theories over evidence, their comfort over truth, their need to believe certain things over their duty to follow where observation led. And that choice, repeated millions of times in thousands of contexts, created a world where children like Caleb had to hide their gifts to survive, where brilliance was dangerous, where being remarkable made you vulnerable rather than valuable. The story of Caleb isn't really about an unexplainable gift. It's about how institutions, armed with the authority of science, will reject any evidence that threatens their power. It's about how entire systems of thought can be built on foundations of prejudice rather than genuine inquiry. It's about how many Calebs there might have been throughout history, remarkable minds crushed or hidden because the world couldn't accommodate what they represented. And it's a reminder that when we dismiss evidence because it makes us uncomfortable, when we cling to theories that flatter our prejudices, when we choose ideology over observation, we're repeating the same mistake those Charleston physicians made in 1859. We're choosing the comfort of our beliefs over the discomfort of truth. What do you think of this story? Do you believe Caleb's abilities were real, or do you think there's some explanation the physicians missed? More importantly, do you think we've learned anything from failures like this? Or are we still dismissing evidence that challenges our comfortable assumptions? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story made you think, if it troubled you or moved you or made you angry, then share it with someone else who needs to hear it. Subscribe to this channel for more stories from history that were deliberately forgotten or buried because they were too inconvenient to remember. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss the next one. Because the most dangerous thing we can do is forget that this happened, that human beings with extraordinary potential were treated as property, that science was corrupted to justify injustice, that uncomfortable truths were labeled inconclusive and filed away. We can't change the past, but we can refuse to repeat its mistakes. Thank you for listening to this story.